Hello, my name is Everix Mahan, and this presentation will examine Eurydice by Sarah Ruhl through a feminist rhetorical lens. This is a play that I absolutely love, and I'm actually in it right now, and I have a show on the night that this is due, so that's very fun. I think theater is such a great vehicle for social commentary, considering it is so vulnerable by nature. It's designed to feel like it gives you a private glimpse into a character's life, and this erodes the need for beating around the bush, so to speak. I've always found this play in particular very interesting to analyze, considering that grief plays such a crucial role in the show, but it's expressed so differently by different characters. I argue that a lot of this is based on gender expectations surrounding emotional expression, including emotional compression, and social constructs both similar to and different from our own. Additionally, this show presents a world in which our normal social constructs are stripped away from the protagonists, and they are left to contend with new social rules dictating who they are and what behaviors are permitted. This presentation will contain passing discussions of acts that can be construed as suicide and in-depth discussions on grief, just so that we know what we're getting into. But before we begin our analysis of feminist rhetoric in Eurydice, we should discuss what the show is. So, Eurydice, written by American poet and playwright Sarah Ruhl, first premiered in September 2003 at the Madison Repertory Theater here in Wisconsin, and eventually ran for 3 months in 2007 at the Off-Broadway Second Stage Theater. It is a contemporary retelling of the Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, but focused on Eurydice's experience in the Underworld. It's about 90 minutes long, with 3 movements and no intermission. And here is a brief plot rundown. So, Orpheus and Eurydice, who are described in the script as a little too young and a little too in love, get engaged and then married. At the same time, we're introduced to Eurydice's father, who died young and waits for her in the Underworld. He was dipped in the river Lethe, but regained his memory by chance, and is now one of the few dead people who remember how to read and write. He writes Eurydice letters, though he doesn't know how to deliver them. While taking a break from her wedding, Eurydice meets a nasty, interesting man who finds father's letter and uses it to lure Eurydice to his apartment. Eurydice ends up falling down the staircase in the apartment and dying. She arrives in the Underworld and is greeted by a chorus of stones who serve as the voices of the strict rules, primarily emotional ones, of the Underworld. Eurydice is reunited with her father, but doesn't recognize him or even the concept of family because the dead speak the language of stones, not the language of the living. Though rooms are not allowed in the Underworld, father builds Eurydice a room made of string. Meanwhile, in the land of the living, Orpheus writes Eurydice letters. Somehow, one of them makes its way to the Underworld, and upon hearing the name Orpheus, Eurydice regains some of her memories, mostly surrounding her husband and her father's identity. Through most of Movement 2, Eurydice asks her father to tell her stories about their family. They generally have some fun, and she tells him some stories about Orpheus as well. She's introduced to Lord of the Underworld, played by the same actor as the nasty, interesting man, and he's also very strict on the rules of the Underworld and generally makes her uncomfortable. Orpheus, after going a little crazy without his wife, discovers a way for his music to get him into the Underworld. When he makes it, he encounters Lord of the Underworld, who explains the rules in the original myth. Keep on walking and don't look back. Obviously, he looks back, and Eurydice is compelled back to the Underworld. Not knowing that Eurydice didn't make it, father chooses to dip himself in the river Lethe again so as not to deal with the pain of losing his daughter again. Eurydice returns and finds her father sleeping after forgetting, writes Orpheus a very, very sad letter, and dips herself in the river too. Orpheus arrives in the Underworld shortly after, and we see him forget Eurydice. He sees the letter, but can't read it, and the show ends. Also, here we've got a picture of Maya Hawke as Eurydice and Brian Darcy James as father at the Signature Theater in New York, which is pretty cool. This production is from last July. It's not considered a revival necessarily because there hasn't really been a break in performances of Eurydice. It's been quite popular since the early 2000s, but I thought it was cool that these very talented and well-known actors were in the show together. Anyway, obviously it is a very sad play and is much more compelling to watch than here explained, but it can provide us a fantastic opportunity to apply some feminist rhetorical concepts. Throughout the show, we gain insight into the social constructs and expectations Eurydice's world and character identities are built on through dialogue from the stones, in particular. We also see various expressions of grief and emotional labor in Orpheus, Eurydice, and Father especially. In this presentation, I will be drawing mainly from the script itself, but I will also pull details from our university's own production from time to time, as I think there is genuine insight to be found in the specific ways that our actors play our roles. Now that we have a clear general understanding of what Eurydice is, we can dive into our feminist rhetorical concepts. The first of which is social constructs. In class, we've mainly discussed gender as a social construct, but we can pull on the concept of social constructs in general to understand the construction of the underworld in Eurydice. Sarah Ruhl's play falls in the genre of magic realism, which was invented as a reaction to modern or avant-garde art, and generally includes modern realism with fantastical or dreamlike elements. Here we've got an example of a magic realist art piece. This is The Painter's Family by Giorgio de Chirico. Ruhl's use of magical realism opens the opportunity for commentary about social constructs because in a setting where practically nothing is abnormal, we subconsciously accept and examine ideas that perhaps we would not otherwise. It opens the floor for greater analysis as we consider what makes this world different from our own. And often what makes the world different is the social constructs that define it. Look at it through Abigail Thorne's descriptions of different Earths in her video, Social Constructs, or What is a Woman Really? When Eurydice enters the underworld, she has been thrown into a new Earth, so to speak, and is left to contend with the norms of the place. Yes, they know what sleep is and what rooms are, but they are not used. They're viewed as unpermissible because of their inherent connection to the living, hence Father being marked as subversive by Big Stone. Concepts that exist, but don't matter much in the earth of the living, have great importance in the earth of the dead, and these concepts have new meanings that were created. Take sleeping, for example. Father explains to Eurydice upon first arrival in the underworld that people don't sleep here. Yet when Father dips himself in the river Lethe in his despair after he thinks he lost Eurydice, we see that the dead are capable of sleeping. But the act of sleep takes on a very different connotation because in the underworld it's associated with choosing to forget everything. As Abbasi, Farahani, and Aziz Mohammadi explain in Politics of Identity in its Cultural Context, a Zizekian study on Sarah Ruhl's Eurydice, by setting the play in the underworld, Ruhl creates a liminal space where the usual cultural and social frameworks of the living world are suspended, allowing identity to be reconfigured. As we've discussed, in the underworld, typical social constructs don't matter as much, and new ones are applied to our characters, causing them to reinvent their identities. In the same paper, the authors explain, Eurydice doesn't recover a fixed identity. She invents one from what remains. When she remembers Orpheus's name, and subsequently who her father is in Movement 2, Scene 6, she's only received a small amount of context as to who she was. The rest is constructed from the world she sees around her, and the information she receives by talking to her father, like in this picture here. One could compare this to one of Abigail Thorne's hypotheticals, in which a group of people's memories are erased and they rebuild existing social constructs because of their environment. Since there is nothing in the underworld to indicate that a book should be read, for example, Eurydice's first response in Movement 2, Scene 11 is to assume that the object will do something on its own. After all, stones are capable of speaking and enforcing rules. What is there to say that books wouldn't do something similar? In terms of identity construction specifically, Eurydice acts very different in the underworld compared to when she was living. At least in our production, Eurydice is much more confrontational and assertive, and at times much more childlike, especially when around her father in the underworld. This indicates that Eurydice's identity was constructed through social constructs in the land of the living, not her biology or anything that she was made of, per se. She's just taking the cues of her environment's constraints and allowances. Later in that same article, the authors explain identity, as Ruhl presents it, isn't something one has, but something one keeps piecing together, clumsily, tenderly, again and again. The fragments never quite fit, but maybe that's the point. Maybe wholeness is just another myth. I think that line is so beautiful, and it really fits in with our analysis here that identity is constructed continuously and framed by environmental factors. We can also connect this to Donna Haraway's A Cyborg Manifesto, in which she argues that the terms and descriptions we think of as identities are very blurry and always shifting. We can see Eurydice struggle with her identity throughout the show due to lack of context and memory, especially after being separated from her husband, who seemed to really define who she was when she was living. We can also apply our lecture about the process of identification to explore how Eurydice and Father, pictured here, disidentify from the dead as described by the stones. For naming, we can observe dead people as a general name for the group Eurydice and Father disidentify from, considering that they dissociate from the traits that the stones argue belong to dead people. For example, the stones argue that dead people can't sing, they speak in the language of stones, and being sad is not allowed. Further, Lord of the Underworld tells Eurydice that rooms and fathers are not allowed. However, Eurydice and Father rebel against these statements, using them as appeals against the traditional expectations of dead people in the underworld, further distancing themselves from them and constructing new identities for themselves within the new social constraints they've been placed within. The traits that Eurydice and Father reject allow us as the audience to connect and align with them as characters, serving as the result of identifying, especially considering that the stones often serve as a voice for our own society on the topic of grief. We, as the audience, don't want to align with the idea that after the initial period of grieving is over, silence is expected. So when in Movement 2, Scene 8, Eurydice tells Father that she would rather know information about presumably living families she can't interact with and be sad than go through a life not knowing them at all, we connect to her. When Eurydice and Father allow themselves to engage with grief, we align with them more, solidifying their positions as protagonists and pitting us against the stones and Lord of the Underworld. The last property of identification, which is the ability to project understanding onto other things to say that they're aligned, doesn't fit very well in this instance, but we can sort of stretch it to say that they're able to project understanding onto the stones, especially to say that they're not aligned. So, in general, this process loosely fits. Finally, we can draw on Olufemi's Olufemi Taiwo's article, Stoicism as Emotional Compression is Emotional Labor, to understand how gendered emotional expression plays a role in the script and performance of Eurydice. For the purposes of our discussion, we will be assuming emotional labor to encompass emotional management in social situations. We are not fully operating under the assumption that relationship interactions are emotional labor, but I will be considering certain specific acts in the show to be loosely under that definition. As Taiwo explains, we should have a careful definition of emotional labor, and as we've discussed in class, it's crucial to recognize that emotions are not the problem, ranking and gendering them are. With that being said, we can also acknowledge that our society views certain emotions and types of emotional labor as masculine-coded or feminine-coded. And despite the show being mostly centered around its heroine, in Eurydice, I believe we see some very interesting examples of different gendered ways to cope with grief, and it makes the difference between emotional repression and compression quite clear. First, we can see the direct consequences of Orpheus's repression. In Khalaf and Diai's article, A Postmodern Study in Sarah Ruhl's Eurydice, Orpheus is described as a man of volcanic passions. His grief overflows from him. He simply can't keep it inside, but he refuses to really feel it. If we're going off of the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief model, he's stuck in bargaining. He tries writing Eurydice letters begging her to return to him, sending books to the underworld, and bargaining with the Lord of the Underworld himself. In the end, though he even presumably kills himself to be with Eurydice again, he doesn't even recognize her. Instead of allowing himself to progress in grieving, he represses his feelings in the hopes of getting her back, serving as an example of the dangers of repression. One could definitely draw connections between Orpheus and the way men are especially expected to deal with grief. They're not expected to process, but simply to move on. While Orpheus subverts that expectation by refusing to move on, we can certainly see the effects of being expected not to process. Next, we can actually use father as an example of healthy emotional compression in the second movement especially. Upon encountering his daughter, he is essentially presented with the task of re-raising her. In order to help Eurydice cope with her new environment after arriving in the Underworld, he adopts the persona of a porter when he explains the rules of the Underworld. Though he expresses clear annoyance and frustration with the stones attempting to force these rules onto Eurydice, he is measured with how he expresses them, so as to keep her calm. When he starts to indicate she's willing to have more fun and learn more about his life, he obliges her in a way that is excited and loving, but controlled. Because his emotional work is for the good of his daughter, we can consider it pro-social, which is a crucial quality of emotional compression as Taiwo describes it. One could maybe argue that his final bits of action, giving Eurydice away to Orpheus, for example, are not exactly emotional compression because his own perspective goes unexpressed until he's alone, but he also acts with the intention of allowing Eurydice the long life he feels she deserves. In our production, when Father returns to the string room and is left with his own thoughts and the river, Father lets his emotions run more freely, which admittedly is probably what's better for him in that moment, however tragic the ending may be. Overall, we can observe Father to exhibit healthy, masculine-coded emotional expression for the most part, at least as described by Taiwo. Finally, Eurydice herself does express traits of feminine-coded emotional labor. For example, in Movement 1, when interacting with the nasty, interesting man, Eurydice ignores her own discomfort to get the letter from her father, putting herself in danger and appeasing a predatory man who manipulated her, indicating the emotional labor asymmetry that we've discussed in class, where women, people of color, and queer people are expected to manage other people's emotions in order to simply survive interactions. We can see another extremely clear example in the final scene of the show, when Eurydice, after losing her husband, returns to find her father essentially dead again, as seen here. She is expected to take on this grief completely stoically, with the stones telling her that to mourn twice is excessive, and she should be less morbid, keep busy, and don't cry. To me, this seems a clear example of how repression is expected in grief for women, too. They're told to avoid being morbid and find new things to think about. They should keep busy so as to better serve the other people in their lives and stop them from becoming uncomfortable. In terms of more minor characters, I think that the stones here really represent how both genders are expected to go about expressing grief. They're kind of a uniting image of how the expectation of stoicism hurts everybody. We can also take the Lord of the Underworld and Nasty Interesting Man to show how the systems we operate in expect people grieving to hold it together in situations that are really uncomfortable, and they just have to keep moving in order to survive. All in all, I think Eurydice presents a fascinating vehicle for exploring social constructs and how we use them to construct our own identities. So much of that is environmental, and I think that's reflected well in Ruhl's script. It also provides a really interesting view into how people of any gender are expected to keep quiet about the uncomfortable parts of grief and keep the cogs of society turning. Even though time seems to stop in the Underworld, that too can only be temporary. I mean, the father says that he's now in the business world, so even in the Underworld, capitalism persists, which is just very depressing to think about. But regardless, things have to keep moving, even in this atemporal space. So it only makes sense that Eurydice and her father would choose to forget, rather than continue to be hounded for their emotions. It's a choice that is undoubtedly difficult, and one not many people would make after grieving a while, but it's certainly common to just want that intense initial pain to stop, no matter what that costs. Part of the very real tragedy of the show is that repression actually wins in the end. And here are my sources. Thank you.